Thank you so much for having me and for inviting me, Elizabeth, and to MCLL for um, having me present to such a great group of folks here. I loved hearing the history of MCLL and just how involved this group is in peer and continuing education. So it's really an honor to be with you all. And to answer Elizabeth's question of how I do this, I live in Toronto and I have two jobs. One is I'm the executive director of Population Balance, which is a US-based organization. It's a nonprofit, and I, my career has actually spanned across many different pathways. So I started out as an engineer. When I first went to school, I attended Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly known as Ryerson, and I studied aerospace engineering. And I loved airplanes and space exploration, which ironically now has been co-opted by Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. So I've turned completely away from anything to do with space exploration, and also just to keep my footprint low, I've stopped flying as well. So that career ended quite early for me. Um, and then I became a high school teacher of science and math and physics in particular, taught about climate change and a lot of other environmental issues. Um, and over the course of my own understanding of the environmental crises that we were experiencing, I became increasingly worried about how little we were talking about climate change. So I became kind of increasingly concerned regarding how little we were talking about these environmental issues within our classes in high school. We were teaching students a lot of skills on how to do well in their job prospects, etc., and how to make money, but not a lot of skills in terms of how to relate to our planet, which is our home. And so in the vein of what this group is about, which is continuing education, I went back to school. I left my teaching career and I went back to school to get a master's degree in a field called humane education, which looks at the interconnectedness between human rights, animal conservation, and environmental ethics, and how our actions can exacerbate one or all of them, and how to, when we're looking for solutions, try to think of not just one, but all three at the same time. And in my master's, I ended up studying the impact of human population growth on the environment, on human rights, on children's rights, reproductive rights. But then I went back a little bit further in actually connecting human population growth itself, not only its effects, but the causes. What is causing human population growth? And why is it so difficult to talk about it? So I grew up in India. I was 17 when I moved to Canada, to Toronto, with my family, with my parents and my sister. And for me, it was a very visceral experience growing up in what was the second most populous country in the world. It was not a taboo subject to say, hey, there's too many people, there's too much pollution, there's too much traffic, there's too much competition for schools. Everything was harder with that many people around. But here, it just seemed, when I started talking about it in my classes, people often would say, well, it's not population, you don't talk about that. It's consumption. Really, that's the main issue. And I said, but who's the one consuming? It's people that are doing the consumption. Of course, there's disproportionality in who's consuming how much and where, and that's where the nuance comes in. But my interest in looking at the taboo of population drove me to do this master's. And the only last thing I'll say to give some more historical background of why I started working in this was also another personal epiphany that I had in my late 20s when I met my now husband, who is from Canada. So he's white Canadian, so different cultural history than mine. And when we were starting to date, he asked me, "Hey, what do you think about kids?" We were both environmentally conscious and, we wanted to keep our impact minimal. And I said, "What do you mean? Don't we have to have kids?" And, he said, "Well, that's up to us. That's a decision we make together. It's a choice." And I said, "What? Really? You mean like I can choose to not have kids?" Um, so to me, that was actually quite surprising that question, that somebody even asked me that question, and to recognize that there was even a choice, because I had kind of been raised with this mentality that everyone, especially, within my country, had to get married and have to have kids, and that was like a natural rite of passage to adulthood. So that moment actually also started to create some, started to turn some wheels for me of like, why did I think this was an inevitability? How many others don't know they have a choice? And if people had true choice, would population not be as big of an issue? Is India so populous because it's such a patriarchal country where so many women actually don't even have a choice to, have the number of children they want, including none? So that was my master's degree. And then I ended up getting this job that was also during COVID, which turned into a virtual job permanently. So I'm very lucky to be doing this. And my second job is I am a senior lecturer at Antioch University, which is in New Hampshire. And I also teach a number of graduate courses remotely there. So that's a bit about me. I'm going to share my slides so I can walk you through my uh, really the unpacking of how I've come to see this issue, and how to get past some of the denial that is so strong in our culture around population. So I'll start with here. I've already talked about my personal story. At Population Balance, we inspire narrative, behavioral, and system change that shrinks our human impact, both in population and consumption, while elevating the rights and well-being of people, all of the non-human world, as well as our planet. We do a number of things because my background's in education. We do a lot of education-centered work. So we try and change this narrative in media by challenging some of this growth biased narratives. We write academic papers and book chapters. And we do presentations like I'm doing here for conferences, classrooms, and study groups like this one. We also run two podcasts. One is called Overshoot, where we have scientists, researchers, and theorists, advocates who come and spend an hour talking to us about all of these different issues. And I run another podcast that I started actually last year called Beyond Pronatalism. Pronatalism is a term that really became known to me when I was asked this question about kids. And I started learning that there's actually a term um, for this kind of feeling of inevitability that a lot of us experience, that we have to have kids. There's a lot of pressure from family, from culture, from religious traditions, from economic policies, etc., to have children. So I started this podcast to start talking to individuals about how are they navigating these pressures and making a choice for themselves that makes the most sense to them, whether that means having kids or not having kids, but coming to it from a truly informed, liberated place. So today I'll talk about three things. I've kind of distributed this across three areas, one being human expansionism, how one species out of so many became so dominant on Earth to the point that we have led to what's now being called an ecocide, which is also in my title of the presentation. What we're doing to nature is akin to what, genocide is to people. That's the definition of ecocide. Then I'll talk about population denial and why so many leading research institutes, scientists, and advocates deny this very scientific fact that population is a major issue in driving the climate crisis, the extinction crisis, the toxification crisis, etc. And lastly, how can we move past this denial in a way that advances social justice and justice for our planet, ecological justice? So to start, human expansionism. This graph shows just the last 12,000 years of human history. Our history goes back, of course, a lot further. We've been around for 250 to 300,000 years. And for much of our history, we lived in small tribes as hunters and gatherers. And that was 99.9% of our history. And the reason I'm only showing the last 12,000 years is this is really where we started to engage in behaviors that are not really reflective of our longer history. So it's about 10,000 years ago. This is post the last ice age. As the climate was, started to improve, we started to engage in agricultural revolution or domestication of plants and animals in a way that we had never done before. Because we were moving around a lot, we never really became a settlement society. And the excess of food availability and storage started to create these settlement societies, which eventually turned into empires and civilizations. I'm jumping over a lot of details just to highlight a few points in history. The rise of empires and civilizations created this need for strengthening those empires, having greater populations, to outcompete other empires, but also to protect the reserves in food and property that we had now control over, which is also when patriarchy is believed to have begun around 5,000 or so years ago. And I'll go into that a little bit more later. And about 200 years ago, with the discovery of fossil fuels, abundant, cheap energy, we were able to grow our human enterprise in a way that we had never been able to before, because fossil fuels allowed us to have create new technologies, start traveling and colonizing different parts of the world, dominating other habitats, destroying mountains and building infrastructure, etc. And it was primarily because of access to so many technologies that we also were able to reduce our child and maternal mortality rates significantly because of advances in science, where we saw a tremendous increase in population from only 1 billion, which is, it took us 250, 300,000 years to get to 1 billion human population. And in just 200 years, we are now 8 times the population at 8 billion. So this immense growth in human population has been called really an anomaly in humanity's history. We have never been this populous. We have never dominated other habitats and really the whole planet this severely before, to the point where we are kind of now, planet has become like a human colony where much of other life has been destroyed and eliminated. And Elizabeth brought up the point about baby boomers that, in a lot of people born in the 50s, the population since then has tripled. Now, my grandmother just turned 99 this year. She lives in India still. She's turning 100 next year. And in her lifetime, she was born in 1926, the population has quadrupled. So it was 2 billion when she was born. When she turned 50, it had doubled. And now as she's turning 100, it has quadrupled in one person's lifetime. And so the state that we're in is called ecological overshoot, in which we are demanding 75% more from the planet than the planet can sustain. And that extra 75% is not really an extra 75% of Earth, because we only have one Earth. So that extra bit is coming from future generations. So we're leaving our children and our grandchildren a more denuded, devastated planet, and also other species, both current and future. And ecological overshoot can also be compared to the act of living off of our credit cards, where we are, instead of living off of our interest, we are eating into our principal amount, so that eventually we're going to draw down on Earth's ability to provide for us. And over the last 50 years especially, we have seen trends in use of energy and materials grow immensely, and waste and pollution grow proportionally. And this period, especially over the last 50 or so years, is called the Great Acceleration, where we are seeing increases in toxification, pollution, climate change, species extinction, etc. And so there is absolutely no doubt that all of what's happened really in the last couple of 100 years is unprecedented in human history. And both our population and our hyperconsumerism has led to this. But why is it that so many people are afraid to mention population, given that it is um, such a recent aspect of our history that population has grown so quickly? So there are leading institutions and researchers that will say overpopulation is a myth and talking about it has dangerous connotations. So that's Sierra Club, the Union of Concerned Scientists, who are doing incredible work, have a statement on their website, a whole page dedicated to saying it's not population that's causing climate change or any of our other crises. They think it's the wrong question and it can lead to dangerous answers. So we see the word dangerous appear several times. Fridays for Future is an offshoot of Greta Thunberg's group, which has a whole page dedicated to overpopulation myth, where they think that the belief that there are more people than the planet is able to sustain is a myth, that we can keep adding more and more and more, and the planet can somehow magically keep growing to sustain our needs. So overpopulation is a scientific fact. It is irrefutable. United Nations, the IPCC, the leading body on climate change, the Royal Society in the UK, and tens of thousands of scientists who have published scientist warnings around climate change and species extinction have called out population along with so many of our other behaviors, including hyperconsumerism, to be the leading causes of many of our social and ecological crises. So why is it so taboo to speak about it? I've split this into four parts. One is human supremacy, this notion that we are the only species that matters, and that the more of us there are, the better, and it's only our needs that need to be met. The other is this notion that it's consumption, not population, and I'll show why it's a false dichotomy. I think this is the one that most of us are probably most familiar with, is past coercive policies that make us a little nervous to talk about population because we often think about China's one-child policy when we think of population. And the last one, which I mentioned, which is also my area of research, is pronatalism, the often undiscussed, unnoticed pressure that's put on people to have children and large families to meet other demographic goals. So the first one, human supremacy, the notion that everything that exists, all the other non-human beings, nature, trees, and all of the biosphere exists to serve our needs, and that we have full authority over what we do to nature and the non-human world. And you can see here from logging and clearing of forests, primarily for agriculture. So, half of for our habitable land, more than half of it is used for agriculture. Majority of it is used for animal agriculture, but you can see other things like, superstitious ideas around animal use and body parts and what they can do for our health, but also the creation of industry, habitat destruction through just fragmenting all of the different places where other species have built their homes. So that's the concept of human supremacy that, we have come to a place where we've led to what I was referring to earlier as ecocide. This graph shows that just over the last 200 years, since our population has grown eightfold from, just a billion to 8 billion, you can see what has happened to extinctions. They have increased proportionally. Today, extinctions are occurring at a rate that is 1,000 times higher than background extinction rates. So species go extinct normally, one species per million, and one species, I think, every million years. And here we are seeing a 1,000-fold increase in species extinction, primarily due to the growth in the human enterprise. And now this is the really shocking graph. I always find it just completely unbearable to imagine what we have done to other species. So currently, if you were to look at all of the land mammals by weight, 96% of all mammals are us and the animals that are killed for food, and only 4% is wild. Now, remember the graph that I showed right at the beginning, post-Ice Age, when we started engaging in the domestication of animals and plants? We, of course, had no domestic animals before then, so this number was 0. We were a mere, not insignificant, but a tiny part. We were only 1% of the total biomass of land mammals. And 99% of the biomass was represented by wild animals. Today, they're only 4% of all of that. So that's an aspect of human supremacy, is that we have completely dominated the planet. So that was one aspect of population taboo, is so many people even today who are panicking about fertility decline. Fertility rates have started to decline primarily as a result of greater reproductive choice. And all these politicians are panicking that we don't have enough babies being born. What's going to happen to our economies? Meanwhile, our populations are still growing. We have never been more massive. So that perspective of that we just need to have more and more humans really comes from that perspective of human exceptionalism, that we're the only ones that matter and we need more of us. The second part is this population consumption dichotomy. In the last 10 or so thousand years, as our population has grown by a factor of 8, our consumption has grown by a factor of 100. We're consuming, this is just in the last 200 years that our population has grown by 8. So with the Industrial Revolution, with the discovery of fossil fuels, we have been able to turbocharge our consumerism and the exploitation of natural resources in order to feed our insatiable needs. We were, of course, doing just fine, surviving and thriving on very little, but still having material security. But now we live unnecessarily lavish lives. And you can see here, even though the consumption has grown by a factor of 100, it hasn't grown proportionally everywhere in the world. There are countries like Canada and the US that are consuming the lion's share of natural resources. And then there are other countries, like India and Brazil, where the populations are quite high, but their living standards are quite low. And it's this distribution, this disproportional use of energy and consumerism that makes this um, question about population and consumerism a little bit more complex. It's not as easy as just saying more people, more consumption. Um, this graph shows actually that um, there are so many countries that have tiny populations, but if everyone consumed like an average Canadian, we would need more than 5 planets. But the other aspect of this graph is proportionality in population. Uh, Canada's population is only less than 40 million. India's population is 1 billion plus 40 million, 400. So it's 1.4 billion, right? So relative to Canada, India's population is significantly higher. And so proportionality really comes into play here is countries in what we see as the global north, which are a lot of these high consumption countries, including Canada, US, Australia, etc., represent a small minority of the total population. The global south is where majority of the population lives, 75%. And as I had said earlier, in this graph, a lot of people within the global south are living in substandard conditions, with many living in abject poverty. And from a social justice perspective, folks living within the global south, especially those who don't even have the most basic material needs being met, deserve to raise their standard of living. And if you look at it from the planetary perspective, what happens when 6 billion people try to increase their standard of living even a tiny bit by improving their consumption? The multiplication of that leads to a gigantic increase in total consumerism, total emissions from climate change, total pollution, species extinction, etc. So this is where this argument that it's only consumption within the global north that is the problem it kind of falls apart, because built into that argument is that people living in substandard conditions should remain that way. They should not improve their standard of living. So of course we need to do both. We need to improve people's standards of living and reduce the hyper-consumerism that's happening in the global north, where we're demanding 5 planets to live like we do. The other aspect here is also interesting, is right now, the global middle class, which is people who are aspiring to live like an average Canadian with access to a house, car, appliances, access to air travel, animal products in terms of their diets, etc. That's growing really, really quickly. It's the fastest growing population in the world, is the growing middle class. And right now, the middle class is growing fastest in the global south. So right now, as you can see, 1 billion new people will enter the middle class by 2030. So this decade, in the next 4 or 5 years. And almost 90% of that population is coming from the global south. So primarily India and China, which are two of the most populous countries. And so you can see also the consumerism rates are rising really, really quickly within the global south, which means we're driving ourselves further into ecological overshoot. But it further demonstrates this point. Is it population? Is it consumption? Well, that's a false dichotomy because people living everywhere are trying to improve their standard of living. So we need to move past this debate, whether it's one or the other. It's both. Yes, it's disproportionate, but we need to address that at all levels in a way that's justice oriented. The third aspect of the population taboo, which I said we are probably all most familiar with, is the policies, past coercive policies. And when we first started becoming aware that we were in overshoot, which was about 50 years ago, it's around when there was a lot of discussion around population. There's an excellent report called The Limits to Growth that came out of the Club of Rome that warned us that if we continued on at our current levels of population, production, economic growth, and consumerism, we were going to transgress a lot of planetary boundaries in the next century. And looking at that report today, the model, even though it was a lot more crude 50 years ago, the projections are almost fully playing out today in terms of how far we've gone into our climate extremes and toxification, etc. So as we were becoming more aware that population was an issue about 50, 60 years ago, especially after the Second World War, there were a number of policies around the world that were put into place. A lot of them were empowering policies that were rights-based policies that recognized that the reason population was growing so quickly in many communities and countries was because of gender inequality. Girls weren't going to school, women didn't have access to birth control, contraceptives, or even the choice to say no to having children. And so a lot of countries actually started engaging in empowering methods, such as ensuring that girls, not just boys, were attending school through to secondary school. And we know the correlation between education and fertility rates is very strong. As women and girls, and generally everybody, has more education, we tend to make choices that are more aligned with our values. Individuals and couples tend to have the number of children that they know they can support, materially, emotionally, but also it allows both partners to engage in other life pursuits, such as work, which for so many decades women have not had the opportunity to do. So many countries actually saw incredible declines in fertility rates because they did all the right things of elevating rights and education. In fact, those were the majority of policies that started leading to fertility decline. But then there were a number of communities and countries that used egregious coercive methods to curtail the population growth. China's one-child policy is one where there was, it was partly, China's one-child policy was in huge part actually motivated by the famine that the country was experiencing at the time that projected to kill millions, hundreds of millions of people. And so instead of trying to understand why population was growing so quickly, due to gender inequality, as many other countries had done, China kind of used a very authoritarian method of dictating how many children one could have. And it included a lot of egregious violation of rights. There were women who were forcibly aborted, children who were forcibly aborted. Um, People were fined severely for having more than one child, and those who couldn't afford those fines would secretly leave their, uh, second child, often girls, on the streets to be picked up. And so there were so many layers of human rights violations that occurred because of that policy that it rightly created a global, um, renunciation of something like this, a denouncement of something this egregious. A lot of people started to be concerned that population conversations will always lead to something authoritarian like that. There were other examples, like in India, in Puerto Rico, a lot of people were compelled to undergo sterilizations or forced to be sterilized. And often these were people who belonged to lower socioeconomic classes, who didn't have a lot of rights in the first place, who could be manipulated easily. Um, and then, some of it was motivated by some horrible ideologies that that already existed, like race science, like eugenics. So when ideas are already present, even though if they've been denounced, those ideas in the wrong hands can inspire people to use those policies again. So there is absolutely no undermining of the fact that human rights abuses took place in the name of population restrictions and population reduction. But so many people became, I think they conflated population with only those policies, and all of these majority of amazing policies got basically sidetracked and sidelined. In fact, it was primarily because of policies like the ones I mentioned that were empowering, like Thailand and Bangladesh and Morocco, Iran, so many more countries, that fertility rates started to decline very, very quickly. Because what they saw is as soon as you give women choice, they tend to choose fewer children. And that's what started to happen, is just people had more choice and we were seeing a significant decline. Um, in fact, a lot of these declines happened faster than China's one-child policy decline, which was through force rather than through empowerment. So in terms of the historical population policies, this is really where that experience that I talked to you about earlier about meeting my partner and my own research really comes into play. Is a lot of people have thought of population policies as associated with efforts to lower birth rates, because we often just think of the last 50 years when we started talking about population and overpopulation in particular. But so many of us don't realize that efforts to increase birth rates have actually been far more prevalent, far more pervasive, and go a lot further back in our history than efforts to lower birth rates. And this brings me to the next part, which is pronatalism. And by definition, pronatalism is a policy or a belief that having children is necessary for our planet, for people, that it's given, that it's natural, and that everyone must have lots of children. And it's pro means for, and natalism means birth. So it's often a pro-birth policy or ideology or narrative that is underlying a lot of cultural belief systems, that everybody needs to have children and lots of children, and that's a good thing. So, as I mentioned earlier with this graph, pronatalism actually goes as far back as the rise of patriarchy about 5,000 years ago. And a scientist, a journalist who's done a really great job explaining how this came about is Angela Saini. We interviewed her on our podcast, and she recently wrote a book called The Patriarchs: How Men Came to Rule. And here she's not speaking about all men everywhere. She's speaking about a group of elite men who were leading empires when civilizations first started to form. And she found through her anthropological research, and it corroborates with a lot of other anthropological research that has been done, is that with the rise of civilizations about 5 or so thousand years ago, there was this need to grow power. Every empire wanted to have not just a lot of people for strength, for its empire strength in order to outnumber other empires, but it also needed to protect the empire. So it needed a large military to protect it from other empires. And these city-states, as they were forming, created this need for more people. And it is around then that this really heightened division of labor by gender started to happen, where women were being forced into producing as many children as they could, and men were being forced to become strong so that they could be sent into the military. Now, what I found absolutely mind-blowing from her research and from others was that people, actually men and women generally, were living in much more egalitarian ways prior to the rise of civilization. Of course, there were different inequalities and different oppressions that were present throughout human history, but this institutionalization of gendered roles, that women needed to produce children for these city-states to grow the population, but also to grow the military power, and that men needed to specifically participate in militaristic endeavors, was very much a feature of this rise of patriarchy and civilizations. And it is really then that the institutionalization of pronatalism began. She goes through all of the different empires and the laws that they put into place to institutionalize marriage, to, where women lose all power. They have no right to property, no right to outside endeavors. They primarily are expected to be mothers and to produce children. And that has kind of remained the rule really for the next 5,000 years of how civilizations have come to be. And in today's day, we see pronatalism show up in so many different ways. It's like the water in which we are swimming. We don't even know it exists, but these subtle or overt pressures that are put on people, whether it's from our family to carry on our genealogical lineage. When are you going to have children? you know, this desire for boys to carry on the family name, or religious pressures to grow the, um, to grow the religious strength. Pressures from politicians and economists so that we have more consumers. Pressures from other politicians so that we can have a larger military, or we can have more of a certain type of people so we don't get overrun by quote unquote the wrong kind of people. Whatever wrong means here, this is happening around the world. These kind of tribalistic, religious, or ethnocentric wars. And here I'll show a little bit more of a lighthearted view of how pronatalism shows up. And you'll all be pleased that the filmmaker is a Canadian. She actually lives in Toronto. And the film she made a couple years ago, it's called My So-Called Selfish Life. Selfish, of course, being a term that's been attributed to people who don't have children. They're often called selfish. So here I'll let you watch this.
Nobody doesn't want kids.
People cannot want kids. It's a thing.
That is not a thing.
Well, it's my thing.
I've known since high school that I did not want to be a mother.
At one point, you just declared that if I ever want to have grandchildren, don't look at me.
I didn't really ever want kids, but I always assumed I would have them.
I kept asking myself, is this going to happen to me? Does it have to happen?
What does it mean to live in a world where motherhood is our destiny? And what happens if we say no?
Remember, your biological clock is ticking.
I gotta have a baby. I gotta have a baby. I gotta have a baby.
Do you have a biological clock?
Not ticking within me, so the answer would have to be no.
There's no biological reason for that to happen.
You could list any number of honors and degrees, and somebody will still think that you're not fully accomplished if you haven't had a child.
Motherhood has increased in value yet again. It's almost fetishized in our society.
This is the real solution to climate change. Babies.
Nations need childbirths.
Babies are good for the economy.
This is by design, this life. I'm not missing anything. I didn't forget to have kids. I'm just not interested.
To have somebody tell you you don't know what's best for you is extremely condescending and insulting. Never question my African identity because I'm child-free.
You can be an aunt or an uncle to your friends' children, and you'll be fine. In fact, you'll be great.
Don't forget to take your pill. I won't.
Mm-hmm. So if you want to watch the full film, it's available from Teresa Schechter, the filmmaker's site. You can just look at My So-Called Selfish Life. You can Google that. But really, the term selfish was one aspect of pronatalism that was normalized. This was part of the propaganda that was used to elevate parenthood as the right thing to do and to shame people who chose to not have children. And there were lots of names created for them to shame them. And this kind of incentive and disincentive structure is very common in pronatalist societies, which almost all countries in the world are, where whether it's tax credits, whether it's valorization of motherhood in media, in commercials, pop culture, we are obsessed with, who's pregnant and can we see the baby bump? If we look at commercials for pregnancy tests, we almost always see the news when somebody's, taking a pregnancy test is always happy news. But we know that actually from a lot of gynecologists and OBGYNs that most people who are actually coming in to take a pregnancy test are nervous and they're anxious because they didn't want to be pregnant at all or at that time. So these are many ways in which pronatalism permeates our culture, where one message is pushed at the cost of any other message. Like a lot of people around the world who are happily single or who are happily child-free, or people who are unable to have children, pronatalism is very unkind to them. They feel an immense sense of guilt and shame because they think that something's wrong with them if they're not able to fulfill this one expectation. And so this notion that everybody must and should have children is rampant around the world, but it's really showing up strongly today when fertility rates, as I showed earlier, are starting to decline, and there's all of this pressure to increase fertility decline. So next, we look at what some of this fertility decline panic looks like around the world. Of course, our prime ministerial candidate, Polyev, got a lot of heat this year when he invoked the biological clock, saying Canadian women weren't having enough children and weren't taking the traditional path. We see, in Hungary, there's this pressure that if you have 4 or more children, there'll be no income tax for life. But that incentive is only good for heterosexual couples. Similarly, in Russia, we're seeing this Mother Heroine Award where women with 10 children will get a small sum of money, but this medal that, what they've done for the country. And Russia, of course, is now starting to reach school-aged girls to promote early childbearing for the country. We are seeing a rolling back of reproductive rights in the US with abortion bans and bans on contraceptives and this surveilling of women's reproductive cycles through apps. So my point here is all of this panic that we're seeing in culture today, in progressive and conservative communities and countries alike, it's not an anomaly. It is a feature of pronatalism. It is a 5,000-year-old propaganda that has basically overtaken our minds and our communities and our countries and how they are run. The reason it's resurging so strongly is because really for the first time in history, women have been able to control their reproduction, their lives. And fertility rates are declining as a result of choice. And that choice represents a threat to so many institutions that depend on population growth. So that's why you're seeing all sorts of messaging like this. A common refrain from people who challenge pronatalism, or a common misconception is challenging pronatalism automatically means that we are promoting antinatalism, or we are saying people should not be having children, or it's bad for people to have children. Of course, that goes totally against reproductive choice. Both pronatalism and antinatalism rely on shaming people, rely on taking away control. One shames people for not having children, one shames people for having children. Challenging pronatalism is not the same as advocating antinatalism. They're actually, two ends of the spectrum, but the same spectrum of taking away choice. What really we should be advocating for is autonomy and responsibility. Right now, most women around the world do not have autonomy. Almost 615 million women and girls alive today were married as children. So these are children who are having children in their own youth. Nearly half of all pregnancies around the world are unintended. And with the lack of access to contraceptives and sex education, these pregnancies turn into births. Almost, so many of them being unwanted births. Some are just mistimed, and a lot of them are unwanted. Of the 923 million women who want to avoid a pregnancy, over 200 million of them do not have either access to modern contraception. It could be physical access, or it could be psychological access because of the barriers that are placed by community members, family members who shame them, or husbands who might beat them up for using contraceptives, or religious leaders who spread myths around contraceptives. Elon Musk has become the loudest voice of population decline alarmism. He thinks that birth control, abortion, and reproductive rights are at the heart of the problem of fertility decline, and that we need to reverse these things. Late Pope Francis, like many popes, has been very pronatalist and has called people who are having fewer children or no children selfish. This is Matt Schlapp from the American Conservative Union, who says, if you're killing millions of your own people through legalized abortion every year, well, if we reduce abortion, some of that problem is solved. And that's what US is currently engaging in, is banning abortions to force people to have children. And this is more of an ethnocentric message from Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. We want to defend Christian culture and will not surrender our country to aliens. So here it's driven by ethnocentrism, that we want more children of our own kind rather than through migration. So to finish, we know from different calculations done by ecologists and scientists that, on the higher end, a more sustainable population for humans is 2 to 4 billion, which is where we were about 100 or 50 years ago. Some argue it's even lower than 1 billion, but even if we went to where we were 50 to 100 years ago, which is not that far, we would, we could get into a more sustainable place quite easily. In fact, I'm going to just go right here. According to the UN projections, only a 0.5 reduction in total fertility rate can lead to a population by the end of this century of maybe 5 or 4 billion. And then if things go where they are going right now with the rise of authoritarianism and a pullback on reproductive rights, we could also, with only a 0.5 increase in total fertility rate, go to 16 billion. So 16 billion versus 6 billion is a difference of 10 billion. And so within the human rights perspective, within a reproductive rights perspective, reducing our human population is absolutely possible. What's needed is really confronting these pronatalist, anti-feminist messaging that's continuing to take away rights for women to choose. And the final slide, social and ecological justice, we would look at our actions from a place of obligations that we have toward potential children, obligations toward others, what fits within ecological and planetary boundaries in a way where people are free to make choices, both reproductive and consumptive, responsibly. An alternative ecological grounded narrative would embrace and help accelerate declining fertility rate and modify policies that celebrate liberated choices. We would embrace an aging population and modify policies that treat our elderly with dignity and not as burdens. We would restructure our economic model so our economy is here to serve us and not vice versa. And lastly, we would abandon our pretense of human supremacy and embrace an ecocentric worldview that upholds Earth's ecological integrity. With that, I am going to pause for break. I thank you so much for your patience with these extra few minutes, and I look forward to the questions that come after.